So 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 6 to 10. So Corinthians is a book that the Apostle Paul writes as a letter to the church in Corinth. We're not reading from the start of chapter 12, but the context is the Apostle Paul is speaking, and he's speaking about a vision that he has from the Lord, and he speaks about boasting about weaknesses. Let's read together from verse 6. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. Or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong."
Thanks, Vanessa. Can I add my welcome to the welcomes that have already been given this morning? My name's Rick. For those that I haven't met, I'm one of the pastors here at Laneway Church. It really is a great joy that we get to come each Sunday and not only gather together to see each other, to have a good time around food and drink, but we get to come to God's Word. We get to actually hear God speak to us, and that's the pinnacle, that's the peak of what we get to do when we come on a Sunday. Now, from the very important to the not as important, I'd like a bit of a survey by show of hands. Who here has seen the show Bluey? Okay, can I say that's not enough hands? There was recently a bit of a furor about one of the episodes of Bluey got ranked as the second best TV episode of all time, of any TV show, not just kids, all time, on IMDb, and a whole lot of people got very frustrated, so they kept voting it down. They kept giving it 1 star. I know, it is a tragedy. And so the only thing I've ever voted for on IMDb was that, and so I tried to rectify that and vote it up again. If you haven't seen Bluey, do it. It's such a beautiful show. Often, Ellen and I, we watched an episode with one of our daughters the other day, and in tears by the end of it, even though we've seen it a bunch of times. If you know me, that's not too surprising that I was in tears by the end of it, but still, it's fantastic. There's a particular episode in it called Promises. I don't know if you've seen it, if you've seen Bluey, but in the episode, Bluey's dad and her, they have a problem with promises. They keep breaking their promises to each other. Bluey doesn't do what she says she'd do. She promised that she would pack away her toys. Bandit, the dad, he says he'll do a bunch of things and to take them to the library. He doesn't do it. And they realize the importance of promises. And so for some reason, at that point, they shift from realizing they should, keep their promises to I can trick the other person with my promises. So Bluey tricks her dad to play this really embarrassing game. So he's like, "You promise you'll play it?" And so he plays this game called Toddlers, where he pretends to be a baby in a library. Whole lot of things. At the end of the episode, Chili, who's kind of like the wise person in the show who kind of tells everybody what's actually right, says, "I think we have a promise problem here. I think we have a promise problem in our house." And she says, because if you can't keep your promises, if you can't trust the other person, then everything collapses. Everything collapses. And Bluey says, "Well, not everything." And she said, "No, everything. If we can't trust, everything collapses." And she says, "What? Even power lines?" It's like, even power lines. Because if they can't trust that we'll pay our bills, they're not going to fulfill their promise to give us power. Everything is built on trust. Promises are built on trust. And I want to suggest our society and each of us as individuals have a promise problem. We have a promise problem. And that problem is not because we don't pay our power bills or anything like that, but because each of us have been hurt by broken promises. Now, I don't know what that would be for you. Sometimes it's the small, it's the trivial. There's the promises, "I'll stop working late." That could end up not being so trivial. Or, I'll stop buying takeout. Broken promises affect our whole country. Have you ever noticed that we've now got this language of, oh, it was an election promise, which somehow is this type of promise which we all kind of understand isn't actually a promise, it's a marketing campaign. Bob Hawke, famous prior Prime Minister of Australia, he promised in 1987 that Australia would have no children in poverty by 1990. By 2020, 750,000 children in Australia are living in poverty. But we go, well, it was an election promise. And I think it's one of the reasons that as a society, we don't actually vote in politicians, we vote out politicians because we realise that their prior promises they've made to us, they're broken and we no longer trust them. Their broken promises crush our trust. And that can be devastating for a country or for the world, but it also hits home. Broken promises can rip apart families. They can cause grief and pain, and they leave everybody grieving. Now, I'm sure for you, there are some promises that have been made to you which you feel the weight when that promise wasn't kept. Our lives are so littered with broken promises, from the trivial to the tragic, that it leaves us finding it hard to trust. We find it hard to trust. We find it hard to trust our politicians. We can even find it hard to trust our families, the people that we want to trust the most. And that means that our collective broken promises mean that we're often walking around with not so hidden trust issues. We find it really hard to trust. But our problems with promises, challenges with trust, means that even deeper problems where we can't rest often in our relationships. And you might have felt this, that in your relationships you can't rest because of the pain of those broken promises and the lack of trust. And I want to suggest that that often leads us to one of two solutions. It means that we can lie down and go, I give up, or we hustle. We work harder. Because I can't trust them, and so I'm going to work harder at what I need to do. Now, my hope for us this morning as we come to this passage, which feels like it's entirely removed, but we've already heard very helpfully from Adam and from Vanessa how this passage isn't irrelevant to our lives. But I want us to see from this passage that it's not irrelevant. It's not just historical events. That what we see here actually shapes our ability to trust. And to trust better promises. And so my hope, my prayer for us this morning is that God will work through this, that we will be able to fix our issues with trusting others because we will be able to rest on better promises and a better promise maker. So to do that, we're going to be looking at the life of Jacob. Now, we've had a good introduction to the life of Jacob. We've heard this morning, we've been seeing this through Genesis. But Jacob's resume is impressive, even if, as you've been with us, he is a very dodgy man. But his resume, the things that he can point to of his life, when he says, look how impressive what I have is, it is impressive. He's a very self-made man. And he, classically in Australia, we have the oldest sibling is the high achiever. Jacob is the second. He's the second born. He's the one that's constantly vying for the position of the older, sees the attention the older one gets, feels that. I'm an only child, so I can say that with no judgment because only children get far more problems than any other position in a family. But Jacob is your classic second child. He's always contending for what his older brother Esau has. And in ancient Near Eastern culture, and in many societies in our world today, potentially your culture that you've come from, the firstborn child isn't just something that the second child wants to attain to. There is a lot of privilege and special focus that is given to that first child. So Jacob was always trying to one-up his brother. So in Genesis 25, we see that he manipulated his brother with food for the right of being the firstborn. A couple of chapters later, Genesis 27, we see that he deceived his father, Isaac, into giving him Esau's blessing. We're already starting to see part of Jacob's name is that he's the heel grabber. Now, that's a bit of an idiom, it's a saying. A heel grabber is a deceiver. I often imagine it's like someone who's hiding under a tablecloth. As someone's walking past, they quickly grab it and cause them to trip. They're a deceiver, they're tricky. They're trying to work out how to get things their way. We're already seeing that in Jacob's life. Then we see in Genesis 29, a couple of chapters later, he tricks his future father-in-law, Laban, Jacob was tricked by his future father-in-law into marrying the wrong sister. He loved Rachel. His father tricked him, kind of flipped it on him, and tricked him into marrying the wrong sister, Leah. Now, that is understandably, if you were intending to marry one person and you ended up marrying someone else, that would cause a lot of grief. But then again, Jacob, well, when he's faced with that option, he can't trust other people. He could lie down and take it. No, he stands up and he grasps. And he wants to improve his resume. He wants what he set out to have. And so he hustles and he works hard to marry Rachel as well. And if you see it and you're still having a challenge with the idea of this polygamy, can I just say again, Josh laid this out for us, this isn't laid out as a good thing. If you see their lives, this is laid out as a terrible family situation. There is bickering, there is backstabbing, there is pain. But it's not enough in their family for Jacob to have two wives. He then sleeps with both of their maidservants as well. So he's now slept with 4 different women to gain the family that he wanted to have. Then he seemingly tricks his father-in-law out of most of his livestock in Genesis 31. He doesn't tell him he's going to run away with all the family. This is a man who is a self-made man. He doesn't trust other people. He has a trust problem. And so he hustles. He works hard. He gets what he wants. He lives up to that name, the deceiver, the trickster. Now, his life is a tragedy in so many respects. It is not a positive life. Even though he actually has quite an impressive resume, his life isn't enviable. You see the brokenness of the relationships. You see that even though he's got all this stuff, his life is good, tainted with tragedy. And a lot of it's of his own doing. And as we turn to chapter 32, what we're looking at today, so make sure that's open, that's where we'll be spending most of our time today. Chapter 32 and 33. Jacob's world, the thing that he has spent his whole life trying to strive, hustle to attain, it's being threatened. So have that story so far in mind. As Vanessa helpfully pointed out to us, Esau, his older brother, said he would kill him. And so the question that we've got now is, if he's going to meet Esau again, what is Esau going to do? What is Esau going to do? But can I suggest from the start of this chapter, we get a hint that something is shifting within Jacob. We get a hint that something is shifting internally within him. We might have a map that comes up on the screen. Now, this isn't an old school map of what this part of the world looked like then. I wanted you to see, this is a Google Maps, what it would look like to walk from Haran, Padanaram, which is where Jacob was living at the time. Haran is a modern city still in the very south of Turkey, to walk through Syria. And you can see the second of the, I should have double checked this with my wife earlier, red, like little map dots, are they red? Yep, great, I got it. If I'm colorblind, so that was a real achievement for me. You see the second one, that's where he's going. He's going to Succoth. That's where he's going. His brother, Esau, lives at the one at the bottom. Seir, the land of Edom. It's now called Jibal Ashuran. That's the journey he's making. Now, if you can see it there, it's going to take him 203 hours of that journey, of walking. So it's a long trip. That part at the bottom, he doesn't need to make it. He doesn't need to make it to go all the way to Esau. But he decides to. He decides to actually send messages to Esau so that Esau knows he's coming. Even though, chapter 27, 41, he said, I'm going to kill my brother after my father dies. Now that's revenge, but it's also a plot, because if his brother, his only brother, is dead, that means that the inheritance that he stole becomes his again. It makes a lot of sense for Esau to want Jacob gone. And Jacob knows it. So we can see that there's something already happening within Jacob's heart, that he wants to make amends with his brother. He doesn't need to go through where Esau's living. There's something happening internally with him where he wants to make amends. So have a look at verse 3. He sends messengers. Have a look. Verse 3 of chapter 32. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir. It's that bottom dot we see in the country of Edom. So he sends messengers. He lets Esau know he's coming. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a mortal enemy. Telling them you're coming and where you are going is probably the last thing that you want to do, but that's what he decides to do. And so he decides he's going to take all the livestock he has, his family. And verse 6, the messengers return, and notice how ambiguous their response is. It'd be terrifying. Verse 6, when the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you. And 400 men are with him." Now, you don't hear that after the last thing you heard from him is, I'm going to kill you. You don't start thinking, he's going to throw me a party. It's a welcome back. No, he's going to kill him. That's all he gets from him. Now, Jacob is brought to a point of absolute fear and distress. Now, I don't know for you if you're at that point right now, if life feels like it's full of fear and distress. This is the point that Jacob comes to. He's spent his life hustling to get what he wants. But he's at the very end of the road. His life, but not only his life, but the life of all of his family is at stake. And so what does it drive him to do? Well, usually, if we're just following the pattern of Jacob, you'd expect him to do something a bit devious. He'll lie to Esau about where he's going. He'll take the long route around. He'll go west of the Jordan River. He'll avoid him altogether. He'll send Esau in the wrong direction. Doesn't do any of that. Something has shifted within Esau's heart. Instead, he prays. Verse 9 and following, he prays. Now, if you're seeing this and you're thinking, well, that's not that surprising that Jacob would pray. He's a figure in the Bible. People in the Bible would pray. That makes sense. This is actually only the second prayer that we have recorded from Jacob. We don't get this picture of him as a prayerful man. We get him as a tricky man. But at this point, he prays. He actually finds a third option. Like I said, when we're backed up against the wall and we realize we're in that moment of fear, we can't trust people, there's broken promises, we hustle or we lay down and let it happen, he's found a third option. He's going to go to someone stronger. He's going to go to someone who is better than all of it. He goes to God. Can I suggest, even though the content of what Jacob prays is different to our situations, there is a great model here that I'm going to come back to later of how Jacob prays and how he sees God in himself. The first thing that we see that he prays, verse 9, read it with me, he acknowledges who God is and he acknowledges the promises of God. He acknowledges God's promises. Have a look at verse 9 with me. O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. Now, I think it's really easy when we see prayers like this in the Bible. We can think this is just some sort of like biblical time introduction to prayer, that you kind of just list a few things about who God is. It is far more than that. He is remembering not just the promise that God has made directly to him, but the promises that God has made to his father Isaac and to his grandfather Abraham. In calling to mind Abraham and Isaac, he's remembering that God is a promising God. From Genesis chapter 12, we're seeing that God has made powerful, global, universe, eternity-changing promises to Abraham, that he would bless Abraham and through him, he would be a blessing to the world. Then God confirmed and remade those promises to Isaac. And then Jacob remembers at the end there that promise to him. Go back to the land and I will make you prosper. Jacob is remembering that God is a promising God and he's resting in that. He's finding a rest in that. After so long, all of that time as we were tracing back through Jacob's life, about all those times he hustled, remember, Jacob had been given promises by God that he would have a family. He had been given promises of God that he would be blessed. He didn't need to hustle for God to give those things to him. He didn't need to strive and deceive for him to get them. God was going to give them to him anyway. Now, God was kind to him, but God was the one who made the promises. And he's starting to realize that God is the one who's in control. God is the one who is good. His resume is nothing to be proud of. The reason he has anything is actually just because God is a good, promising God. Jacob starts to realize that he's like the prodigal son. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that story that Jesus tells. The prodigal son of the son who basically manipulates, steals his inheritance from his father, the thing that he didn't deserve yet, and then realizes at a moment that he needs to come back to his father. He took his inheritance when it wasn't rightly his, but he realized that he could trust in the God who promises. But the second thing we see in verse 10 is not only has he acknowledged that God is the promising God, he acknowledges his own unworthiness. His own unworthiness and God's kindness. Have a look at verse 10. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. If you're looking for a confirmation that the things that Jacob has done so far aren't being affirmed by God, this is one of the moments of clarity that we see in Jacob, that he was unworthy of all the things that God has given to him. He was unworthy. The things that he did weren't the right way to get the promises of God. But God was still kind. He was still kind to give him the family that he had promised. Despite his sin, despite the evil ways that he did it. The only reason he has anything isn't because of himself, but because of God's faithfulness and mercy and faithfulness to his own promises. The third thing we see in verses 11 and 12 is that he asks for God's continued kindness and to remember his promise. Have a look at verse 10, 11 with me. 11 and 12. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come back and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. Again, that's not just him trying to manipulate God. I take this as a change has happened. A change has happened within Jacob, and he is remembering God's promises, and he's asking, instead of trying to deceive his way to get what he wants, instead of deceiving Jacob, he's going to trust God. He's going to trust that God is the one who has promised these things to him. And if he has a family, he's going to trust that God is the one that's going to protect them. Because God, for him, this was a particular promise for him, that he was going to have a family that couldn't be counted, like the sand of the sea. There was a deep shift within Jacob. If you've hit that point, like I said before, of fear, of grief, of pain, I just want to suggest, we'll come back to this, but I just want to suggest that isn't something that you should necessarily interpret as, well, I have no hope. If you're here and you want to find out about God, if this is you coming today because you want to hear from God, can I suggest, like with Jacob, how he used his fear to remind him of who God is. In his fear, he didn't hustle. He didn't try and just make something of himself. He didn't just lie down either. He trusted the good God. And can I suggest to you today, we're going to see a bit more about what that looks like, but that's what I hope happens for you today. With the promises that have been broken to you, you're finding it hard to trust, we can actually trust God. Come to God. Because we have that struggling to trust, God is someone we can trust. He's actually the only person we can trust with his promises. There's a few reasons he's the only person we can trust with his promises. The first and most obvious is that God has made promises time and time again that he has said that he would do, and he has done them. That's one of the main ways we work out if someone is trustworthy, isn't it? We look at prior behavior. And that's often the point when relationships, things break down, when we vote out prime ministers or whatever it is because we've just had our trust broken one too many times, and we just can't do it again. God is faithful to his promises, and we see that again and again and again. Every promise that God has made, he keeps. He's faithful. Second reason we can see that we can trust him is because he is eternal. He is unchanging, we are changing. This is one of the really incredible things, that God is the creator and we are not. It's because we know how fickle we are as people. We see the people around us and their failure to live up to what they said they would. And you might even feel it in your own heart and your own life, your own failure to do that. But God, if God is the eternal God and he is unchanging, that means when he makes a promise, something's not going to happen to him which shifts and changes. It means we can no longer trust him. He's the unchanging God that is firm. More firm than this earth. More firm than the universe. He is the one who is unchanging. So when he says he'll do something, he will. And the last reason we can trust it is because he is perfect and we are not. He is perfect, we are not. And so when we look at people's broken promises, we can look to God and remember that he is perfect. And when he makes a promise, he is perfect. He is good. He will keep his promise and do what he said he would. Compared to God, any promise maker in this world, the best, most reliable promise, where some deeply entrenched law or some just incredibly faithful person, is basically like a shoddy used car salesman. No one can stand next to God when it comes to promises. God is the only faithful one. We'll come back to that, but I want to suggest now that God is the solution to our problems with trust. Because he does and continues to make promises that we can rest in. Now, we'll come back to these events. We'll come back to that later. Now, we get to this point where Jacob wants to present a gift, a huge gift to his brother Esau, to make amends. But the problem with sending gifts is that now Esau knows exactly where Jacob is. He can follow the gift right back to him. Now, if he was trying to deceive him and throw him off the track, this would be a good tactic, but it is not. He sends gifts, and I think that's one of the reasons that we see during this, that Jacob actually sleeps that night separate to his families, because he knows the risk. He trusts God, but I think he's still aware of the risk that he's in danger, and he doesn't want to put his family at risk. And so he stays by himself. And that's where we get to that point that is like that singing in the rain moment that Sarah was talking about. I don't know what that scene is. But it's that moment that doesn't make any sense when you read through it. And I'm almost a little bit sad that I'm taking most of our Bibles have a little bold heading above verse 22 there, Jacob wrestles with God, because it means that from the outset of this part of the account, we know exactly there's something where he's wrestling with God that's about to happen. But if you were reading this for the first time, Esau said he's going to kill him. They're coming closer and closer. We've got this ambiguous, he's coming with 400 men. When you see verse 23, after he had sent them, his family, across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. Verse 24, so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. I gather what we're supposed to expect is happening there is that Esau, or one of his hired 400 men, is coming to kill him. We think this is when it's going to happen. That promise in 27:41, I'm going to kill my brother, this is the point that it happens. And what's going to happen? Well, slowly as this unravels, as we find out at the end, there's some sense where Jacob is coming face to face with God. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have time, because this is such a huge thing, to go to all the different nitty-gritty of what's going on here. But I would suggest you might have a few questions at this point. If these aren't your questions, I want to suggest that's okay. Feel free to listen somewhat, and I'll call you back in a moment. But if these are your questions, the first is, well, basically, is this really God wrestling with Jacob? Is this really physically God wrestling with Jacob? And I want to suggest yes and no. Yes and no. I sometimes like to, dot to dots. You've got the numbers and you can make a picture out of dot to dots, but it's not like a Mozart. It's not like an incredible painting where you can see all the detail. Sometimes the truths that God lays out to us are like a dot to dot. We can see that in some sense, here Jacob is wrestling with God. He comes face to face with God. That's one dot. But we also know from later in the Bible that no one has come face to face with God and lived. So this is God, but in a sense it's not. And Hosea 12, one of the later prophets writing the Bible, Hosea 12:4, feel free to look it up later, he reflects on this moment and says that at this point, Jacob was wrestling with an angel. It's actually how he describes it. He recounts this story as Jacob wrestled with an angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. So, in some sense, this is God. He is able to accurately say he's come face to face with his God, but not in the way that we might expect. This is through an angel, a medium, some sort of mediator that is come in God's stead so that Jacob realizes he's come face to face with God, and even though he's about to come face to face with his brother who wants to kill him, the real person he needs to come to terms with is God. He needs to come face to face with God himself. The second question you might have is, well, why can't the man/angel who's representing God in verse 25 overpower Jacob? If God is God, why does it seem like Jacob's winning? And again, we've got a few dots here. We know that Jacob seems to be winning, but then at the same time, the man-angel is able to touch Jacob's hip, and just with a touch, his hip seems to, a tendon comes out of, something happens. I was planning, that just reminded me, I was planning on talking to someone who knows medical muscle stuff to try and explain to me what just happened in this moment. I have no idea. Something happened, he's injured, he's limping. By a mere touch. Now, there's, again, a weird thing going on here where Jacob is stronger, and yet the man is stronger because he is able to, with a touch, just dislocate or something his hip. Now, that raises a few things which I'll come to in a moment, but the third question you might have is this Jesus? Jesus is the one we might be familiar with, who is God, but comes in the form of a man. Is this Jesus? And I want to suggest, although that might be tempting, I want to say this isn't Jesus. This isn't Jesus. There's something that's really important about the fact that when Jesus came into the world, he came as a human at that point in history. It was a unique event that was happening when Jesus was born, and he lived the life that we couldn't live, and he died in our place. There's something unique and important that's happening there. And yet, I want to say there's a few things that we can see which are almost hints about Jesus. That he is a person who has overcome. He is a person who has overcome by others at his death. And yet we know from Jesus as well that he is stronger than all of them, and that at a moment he could call down heaven's power and be free. Like this man is able to touch Jacob's hip and injure him. There is both a frailness and a power. I think it's a hint to who Jesus will be and how Jesus will come and live in the dirt with us. We see a picture of Jesus. I don't think we see Jesus himself. But for Jacob, the important thing is that he is coming face to face with God in some sense, and he realizes that coming face to face with God is what he needs to do more than coming face to face with Esau, his brother. And we know that this is more significant because this is the point where Jacob is renamed Israel. And when God renames someone in the Bible, it's almost like they've been on one track with the name that they've had from their parents, and God renames them, and he says, yes, this is who you are, but I'm remaking you into this person. He is Israel, the one who has wrestled with God. And that is the name that gets given to God's people, Israel. And so the point that I want us to see in all this is that it's weird, there's questions, love to keep wrestling with it over this, with this passage with you later. That wasn't intentional, I'm not that, yeah. Jacob recognizes that even though he seemed to have some sort of physical advantage, he needed to come to terms with God. God is the one who really has the power in this situation and in all situations. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because we all want to be in control of our own lives. We all want to hustle. But the good news is that God is in control and we can trust in him. Now, we'll come to a bit more of this in a little bit, but I just want to say, if you are someone who already knows Jesus and you already know his promises, it can still be hard for us to trust in them in the day-to-day. It can be hard for us to rest in the promises. I want to say this picture shows us that there is something powerful in being able to rest in this God. Not only the good God who is faithful to his promises, but the God who has come to Jacob and comes to us as Jesus has come to die for us. We can rest in that. And I think there's a temptation that I'm more and more realizing that we have as Christians. And if you're someone who is exploring Jesus and exploring God, you might feel this as well, but my faith, I know I need to trust in Jesus, but my trust isn't perfect. I feel the weakness of my own faith. But notice, that's not the point. The point is to trust the one who is reliable. God knows that we are weak, even in our faith. The point is to rest in the one who isn't weak, the one who makes good promises, who we can trust in the good and in the bad. As I said, we'll come more to that in a bit. But I just want us to bring out to that last section that Vanessa helpfully read for us. Because if coming face to face with God is what he really needed to have happen, then you'd think in one way the event should stop there. But it doesn't. He still needs to have some conclusion, some reconciliation, or something happen with his brother. And that's what we see happen in chapter 33. And so chapter 33 starts with Jacob looking up, and there's Esau. It's ominous. Coming with his 400 men. And so he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants, and he puts them all in order, but he goes on ahead. He's fearful, but again, he goes in front. He goes in front of them. We see something has shifted for him. He goes in front to meet Esau. And then we have this beautiful moment where in verse 3, he himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. It's a picture of humility, and 7 times a picture of complete humility, that he's telling Esau how low he is. And then verse 4, I really didn't think this was going to be a sermon that I'd get choked up. It's going to happen every time, I think. Verse 4, but Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him, and he threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. What a beautiful picture. Esau, who was going to kill him and has 20 years to stew on that, instead runs to his brother and embraces him. Now that is a beautiful picture. That is a beautiful picture of reconciliation between 2 brothers. And again, I don't know our different life situations, but I do know humanity well enough to know that there are people here who are wrestling with real broken relationships. And that is real. And I do want to suggest that knowing God, if both people can humbly know God and come to each other, that offers opportunities for beautiful reconciliation. But I also want to suggest that that's not the biggest thing that's happening here. And I want to suggest it a little bit further than where Vanessa read for us. Verse 10. Because when Jacob sees Esau, he's not just reconciling with his brother, it's him seeing the character of God in his brother. Look at verse 10 with me. they've had this back and forth about the gifts, and Jacob says, "No, please. If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you've received me favorably." Now, if you've read that through your own reading through small groups this week, that might be a weird verse. Like, what do you mean? He actually has seen God. Why would he say that about seeing his brother? I want to suggest it's because in Esau's response, he is seeing the love of God, the compassion, the mercy, the forgiveness of God in that loving embrace. And the reason that I think it is because it's the picture that Jesus picks up for us in Luke 15 of the prodigal son's welcome home from his father. Listen to this. The prodigal son decides to go back to his father. He says, verse 18, "I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.'" Notice the similarity there? Realizing he's not worthy, calling himself a servant, exactly how Jacob went to his brother. Verse 20, "So he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him." Jacob is able to see it's like seeing the face of God because he's seeing the mercy and the compassion and the forgiveness of God in his brother's forgiveness of him. Jacob can rest in the forgiving, compassionate, merciful God. And friends, I want us to be able to do the same. We have a God who has come down into the dirt of our lives, Jesus, and he knows the brokenness of this world. He knows the sinfulness of our hearts more than we do. And he has come into this world to die on a cross so that God has made a promise that if you trust in him, don't think you have to have this perfect faith. Again, that's you trying to hustle faith into a work. It's not perfect faith. It's you coming to Jesus and trusting his death on the cross is how you can be right with the Father. And this beautiful, perfect, promise-making and promise-keeping God runs to you and embraces you and kisses you and forgives you and welcomes you back into his family. With all the brokenness of promises that we feel in our lives, the promise of having that God who we have hurt far more, the one that we have rejected with our lives, wanting to come into this world so that we can have that embrace from God as a father, is one of the most beautiful promises that you could ever be offered, and it is one of the few promises, because it is from God, it is one of the promises that you can have a confidence in. So if you don't yet trust in Jesus, I want to say, if you today said, I need to trust in Jesus' death, not because my faith is something that gets me there, because I realize I need to just lean on him, humbly come before him, acknowledge that I'm not worthy, then God will come to you and accept you now and into eternity, into a beautiful new creation. I'm going to pray in a moment for us, and if that is you, please pray. And we're going to actually use Jacob's prayer as a bit of a model. And if you already are one of God's family, if you already trust in Jesus, can I say, keep resting in these promises. Rest in the promise of eternity. It isn't yours because of you, it is yours because of Jesus and the God who cannot change and who keeps his promises. I just want to read one verse, and I want to encourage you, maybe memorize this verse. If that's something you're struggling with, for time, I'm just going to read this verse, and I want to say, memorize it. If you struggle to remember, I'm saved not because of what I've done, but because of God, that beautiful, compassionate God, remembering me because of Jesus. John 10:28. Memorize these words of Jesus. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. That is a promise from God. If you trust in Jesus, he will give you eternal life. Rest in that. I'm going to give you a moment to reflect about the promise maker God, the promise keeper. Do you realize that you need to pray that prayer today? To come face to face with your God. Recognize that you're not worthy and take that embrace. And if you have already done that, the second part of what I'll pray is for you, that we can take hold of that eternal life and remember that promise. The prayer, I think, will come up on the screen so you can see it as I pray it. And you can just pray this in your own heart. Can I encourage you, tell someone after that you've prayed it. God who spoke to Jacob, who makes firm promises, we are unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown to us. Save me, we ask, from your just judgment that we deserve, because we couldn't stand. Save me by the death and resurrection of your Son, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus, that when we trust in you, you have promised to give us eternal life, that we will never perish and that no one can snatch us out of your hand. Give us a joy in knowing that you are the God who has come to us. Help us fix our eyes not on the world we see, but the world we cannot see, that you have told us that we will inherit. Amen.
God rescued Jacob despite his frailness and his sins, his forlornness. He wants us to hope in him and to look to him and to trust him, to do the same in weakness and in dire circumstances.